is directly involving any audience members. So when we get to Q&A, if we do any questions directly with the audience, we won't be recording that. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat box. We want this to be an engaging session. So could you also please ask any questions in the chat box, and we'll put this to our panel during the session. Amy Lee, who's in the screens, you'll find is very kindly helping us with the Zoom call support this evening, or morning, afternoon. So please message her directly in the chat box if you have any issues. And finally, we'd really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on your social media with the hashtags to our GBF accounts, GlobalBioFund accounts, which Amy will share in the chat box. So what is imposter syndrome? I must admit, I've seen a few variations on themes around it, but the one I quite like is this one: a pattern of thoughts in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments, and has an internalized fear being exposed as a fraud. Research in 2019 done by Total Jobs suggested that up to 70% of us, male or female, of all ages, and regardless of the years of work experience we have experienced it at some point. So it's quite common. And as someone who has personally experienced it, I'm glad to say it's fairly common, and it even impacts admired and famous people like Michelle Obama, Tom Hanks, Jodie Foster, Albert Einstein, Maya Angelou, and Arianna Huffington, just to name a few people who have spoken out publicly about this. So what we're going to kick off with is find out how common this is with our audience, and we've set up a poll. So could our audience please vote using the poll on whether they have personally experienced this or not? And don't worry, we will only get to see the results and not how you vote. Is that something we can cover? There we go. So how do we... A few more seconds for a few more people to vote. Okay, well, I guess that's very common in our audience. Only one person, 4% not having experienced this. So can I get rid of those? Is that share results? Okay. Okay, so you can see it's actually very common among our audience as well, just as well, we're putting this on. So let's introduce our panel members to you. What a group of high achievers we have assembled tonight. We have a rowing world champion, industry shakers and movers, inspiring entrepreneurs, driven farmer leader, and actually currently practicing coaches on our panel. So panel, could I please ask you to give the audience a flavor of who you are by telling us a little bit about yourself and what your passions are? And can we start off with Wendy?
Sure. Thank you, Giorgio, and greetings to everybody around the world, wherever you are. I am myself located in Washington, D.C., and have been living here about 30 years. I am currently a leadership coach with about half of my time. And the other half I spend working with entrepreneurs, investing in early stage companies. And I've been doing that since the sort of mid 90s. And my passion is both working with entrepreneurs and helping bring leadership, personal leadership development to them, not just coaching around their businesses, but helping them grow as individuals and as leaders. And my other passion is helping people who've never invested in early stage companies, particularly women, understand what it is they have to contribute to that investment process, and how a lot of life experiences, a lot of common sense, a lot that they've lived through can be great contributors, even if they don't have financial or business backgrounds. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Jane, you're on mute. There you go.
All right. So thanks. Great to have such a big audience touching, I think, a really important topic for discussion. So thanks for organising this. So my background is I started out as an academic in molecular biology and went on to join a biotech startup in the early 90s, which was very successful. We actually made a drug called Humira, which became the best-selling drug in the world, and I think possibly still is. That company was called Cambridge Antibody Technology, and we were acquired by AstraZeneca. And my career kind of grew into being a bench scientist in a small biotech through to being head of the R&D facility for the biologics unit of AZ in Cambridge. And then, so that was over a period of 2.5 decades, really, where we spent a lot of time making some really interesting medicines. And then a couple of years ago, I left to be a founder of my own antibody discovery company, trying to understand why people are well and why people stay well and what makes them well. So a really interesting career. And I'd say my passions, certainly from a very young child, was science. I used to collect rainwater in the garden and monitor. I used to be a big data collector, see how much rain there was every week, and there was a lot in Yorkshire, which is where I grew up. But then, so I took that passion for science, and I think actually a real turning point for me was when we first converted that science into a medicine, and the very first patient who benefited from that medicine that we met came and spoke to us, and she was a lady who suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and explained how taking Humira had just basically changed her life, and she could now do things she couldn't do. And from there, my passion became not really science, but applying the scientific tools that we were building to make medicines. So that's always my passion, but also on top of that, I share some of Wendy's passion for mentoring, building teams, supporting young researchers, STEM education. I do a lot of work on STEM education. And then finally, I am a mother. I have 2 moderately grown-up children now, but yeah, I'm very passionate about making sure that those guys are doing okay and are navigating the world as well as possible in these interesting times. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Rosemary, can we hear from you? And maybe you could go into a little bit about the sort of area of work you're doing at the moment as well.
Yes, thanks, Giorgio. Thank you very much, everyone. Kia ora, welcome from New Zealand. My name is Rosemary, as I said. I've been a lot of things, a sportswoman, a coach, a dream enabler, a writer. I'm running a business supporting older women who are re-entering into the workforce just to live their dreams, to be who they'd like to be and whatever. Along with enabling, and my passion is like bringing on the next generation after me so that they can be the people they are. I wanted to use my experiences with rowing about how I became a world champion sculler. The ideas behind the motivation and the psychology used in high performance sport that I wanted to bring to this discussion on imposter syndrome. And if you look at my backdrop, I've chosen a single sculler on Lake Twizel, which is on the World Championship circuit, because it gives you an idea of how lonely this sport can be. The key idea I want to share with you is that with the phenomenon of imposter syndrome, it's a self-doubt in one's abilities can be a two-edged sword. It can either destroy you, cripple you so you can't move for your fear, or you can use it to cut a sway through life to your goal. When I was rowing, I had a crippling self-doubt that I wasn't good enough, that feeling somebody would discover I was a fraud. And yet, in the same breath, it also motivated me and fueled my drive to perfect my technique, to be fitter than the people that I was training with, who were often men. And the long story short, it's a complicated, dynamic relationship that led me to the pinnacle of my sporting achievements. I thought it might be helpful to start the quick summary of why people feel that they're imposters and how it often manifests themselves in its behavior. And when we look at why I potentially have this crippling self-doubt, can also be the key to the success. The initial research done by Pauline Clance and Susan Nemes discovered this widespread pattern of highly accomplished women dismissing their accomplishments and believing that their success would disappear once others discovered their awful secret. They were imposters. It's a chronic self-doubt. It's prevalent, as you know, among high achievers. And originally, Clance and Nemes interviewed professional women across a range of employment sectors. But the additional research has found that it's more common among women in marginalised communities, women of colour, the LGBTQ communities, women who are alone in a male environment. And it's not exclusive to women, as Giorgio has pointed out. Men also experience this phenomenon too. And there's a number of factors, one or combinations of these, that contribute to it. The way you were raised. You could be a student. You work in an organisation that feeds the self-doubt. You're working alone in professional isolation. Or you work in a creative field where you're always looking for new ideas and ways of expressing them. You could be a stranger in a foreign land, moving from one culture to another. Or you represent an entire social group where you strive for excellence because making any mistake is going to give the men with the amount of power that they have to appoint the next woman the excuse that, oh, we can't appoint another woman, she's no good, they're no good. And these feelings that imposter syndrome generates can manifest itself in a number of behaviours. There's the perfectionists who set the excellency high goals that manifest itself almost as a control freak, as they're the only ones who can do anything to their expectations of a high standard. The super women who push themselves harder and faster to achieve their goals. The natural geniuses, where competence is measured on the ease and speed with which they can do things. The soloists who think that asking for help's a sign of failure. Or the experts who feel that they've got to be the expert in everything they say they do, and if they don't know anything, they're incompetent, they failed, whatever. I think the important thing to remember is that everybody's different. For some people, accepting that they might have imposter syndrome might be helpful. It gives them a label to means to accept who they are. But for others, it might be harmful. And I think in the emotions, there's a whole gradation scale from the moments that everybody has of self-doubt right through to the chronic self-doubt where daily, almost in everything you do, you're doubting what you're doing and all the remit in between. Personally, as I said, I hold this theory that it's a two-edged sword. The very self-doubt in one's abilities is the intrinsic element that enables you to reach your goal. For analysing my route to success in the sports world, I realised that I'd used my self-doubt and feelings of being absolutely no good to being a good end. Sculling is a type of rowing, which is one of the most three high-demanding sports, cycling and swimming being the other two. I'd been good at sports at school, but when I stepped in a sculling boat, I found something I absolutely loved. Oh, unusually for an oarsman, oarswoman, I went from being an absolute beginner to racing at the national championships in the UK within 6 weeks. I was rowing in a very male-dominated world, and I often felt that my abilities were being overlooked. There's this thing about representing your whole demographic that I mentioned earlier. I was one of a handful of women, so I battled against that feeling that I was an outsider. The lack of respect in my abilities also added to my insecurity. I felt I had to try harder to gain that respect. Plus, being as a single sculler, as you can see, it's very isolated. It's like being a solo entrepreneur. From that inauspicious start at the national championships, when I hadn't even done a racing start, I went on to win many times. But the battle was hard, and I made many, many mistakes. After losing, I would get off the water exhausted and be told, well, you should have done this and you should have done that by one of my fellow oarsmen. I just dreamt of winning a medal at the World Championships, which was being held in the UK. I recognised I needed someone to help me get over that feeling that I was no good and help me to win. So I approached one coach who was having a series of successes with women's crews. I don't know anything about sculling, he responded. Yes, but I replied, you have something that you can teach me, something far more important than how to scull. I want you to teach me how to win. We went on from there. So with the World Championships as my goal, I worked with this coach to refocus my feelings of insecurity and self-doubt, to use them to help me to win. I recognized that asking for someone for help was not a sign of weakness. I reframed it as seeking the advice of someone with a different expertise who would work with me as a team to achieve my dream. In that search for physical excellence, I was driven to become fitter and stronger than ever, to prove that I was good enough. In the mixed training sessions or in the gym, I raced against whoever I could who was to get fitter than I was ever before. On the water, I analysed every single stroke, spending hours on my sculling technique, erasing deficiencies, anything that would slow the boat down, trying to make it go as smoothly as possible. Each outing, I crawled out of that boat exhausted, barely able to stand. From one perspective, you might say I was trying to be Superwoman. But from my perspective, I was just trying to get better. I was desperate to get faster. All this work continued until the day I found myself sitting on the start line of the World Championships, a bag of nerves. Was I good enough? Would I do it? After all this work, was I going to be good enough? I was struggling to keep my knees from knocking and my breathing under control. And as anyone here will knows, the first thing that goes when you're under stress is your breathing. But if you're going to row well, you need to be able to breathe properly. So this is where the imposter syndrome was a bit of a hindrance. But at the same time, that fear of not being good enough also helped motivate me. Like I said, it's this double-edged sword. And then once I got started, hearing my coach yell, "You can do this," from the sidelines, helped squash down that feeling of the insecurity. I refocused on being who I was, an excellent sculler. It reorientated my motivation, my adrenaline, my energy, where I was needed. So on reflection about the influence that imposter syndrome's had on me, I would say that I've accepted my feelings of being inferior, that my success is a fluke, and it will never go away. I've learned to accept that imposter syndrome will always be with me to a certain degree. It could have been a monster that destroyed me, but that same monster's been tamed. It's become a friend. And the message that I've got is that you can use it to your advantage by setting your own criteria for success, not the ones that are imposed on you by the perception that you have to be this or that. What this world needs is you, just as the way you are. Use that intrinsic ability of self-reflection to think about who you are, focusing on your strengths, and identify those areas that might need further development. Use it as a motivation to train or work harder. Employ that restless search for excellency in the search for new drugs, as we've seen with the COVID-19 vaccines. But also recognize when you achieve your goal. Reframe that perception that you're not showing off by being Superwoman or Superman. right? But that you could be somebody else's role model, something to aspire to. I even found men adopting my training techniques and changing their attitudes towards women because of what I was doing. Give yourself permission to accept that you have triggers. There could be words, there could be certain situations that trigger those unwanted emotions. Learning to recognize those triggers and adopt strategies to deal with them will go a long way to stopping them derailing you. Find yourself a supporter, a mentor, a coach, a group of friends who, whatever works for you, that will stop this feeling of isolation. It took me a long time to acknowledge that ignoring this monster made her worse. Recognizing that she existed calmed her down, and she's worked with me to become a friend. I wish everyone here success in whatever you do, because I'm passionate about helping other people succeed, because I just know you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing such a personal journey. It's lovely to hear it, and amazing. I hope everyone's really enjoyed that. In helping women you've coached with imposter syndrome, have you found any age groups that are particularly, in your experience, affected by it? Is there any bias that you've seen with women you're helping?
Sorry, who was that addressed to?
To you,
Giorgio?
sorry, Rosemary.
Oh, sorry. No, I haven't. As I said, it comes from different age groups, different walks of life. I'm currently researching into whether it's a personality issue and how that affects you too. So if anybody's got their Hogan or their Myers-Briggs scores that they'd like to send me to add to my research pool, I'd be very grateful. But yeah, no, I don't think there's anything that seems to cross boundaries. I think there's one thing that might add to it is a lot of it is growing up. The principle of, like, give me a child before 7, I'll show you the person, I think actually does have a lot to do with it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Wendy, have you had experience with your coaching of women at particular career stages, ages that you found are more affected by it, or seem to recognize it more?
You know, I think I see it a lot in women in their sort of mid-career, high potential women in mid-career, maybe in their 40s, who, you know, Rosemary mentioned being perfectionist as one of the characteristics, or one of the types, maybe. I see that, a lot of that, and this notion that everything has to be perfect means you are never perfect. So therefore, you know, how can you possibly be good enough at what you're doing? I do think there's something tricky about some of the models we grow up with. And I think, you know, talking about sports and athletics is an interesting way of maybe looking at one of the things that's problematic. We look for outcomes, we look for measures of success. And when we're doing most of the things we do, unlike sports, there's not a simple winning and losing. There's not a simple measure of success. So it's really tricky in your ordinary work, you know, to figure out, are you good enough? If you're a lawyer and you didn't win the case, does that mean you weren't good enough and you're an imposter? Or does it mean there were all these external factors that came into play that, you know, you might have tried to plan for, but you couldn't do it? In the science world, which, you know, I'm seeing in the chat, a lot of people on this are quite naturally in the sciences. You know, is it only the people who come up with the amazing drug that becomes the blockbuster drug who are successful? You know, and is everybody else an imposter? Of course not, would be, you know, what I would say. We all contribute in so many different ways, and being able to look at that. So I do think one of the complexities around imposter syndrome is who or what are we measuring ourselves against? And is that a realistic thing to be measuring ourselves against, or even a valid thing to be measuring ourselves against?
Perfect. Thank you for that. We did think it'd be interesting to take a snapshot of the poll, another poll, on the ages and stages of career potentially of the audience members. So I don't know, Amy, we've got the poll. We can, there we go. Brilliant. That'll just give us an idea of where people are at in their career stage, so we can cater to that. And whilst we're doing that, Jane, is that something you've come across with people you've worked with? Have you noticed it bias to any career stage? Or
I think it comes and goes. I mean, from my own personal experience, I suffered very badly from imposter syndrome when I was a student. You know, I got a place at Cambridge and always felt that was a lucky break. You know, I never sort of felt a fraud. I just thought I had an unusual amount of luck. But in retrospect, you know, I think you create your own luck, and if you work hard, sometimes you can kind of label that as luck, and it's not. And actually, it's quite good when other people tell you it's not. So, but then I had 2 children in quite rapid, you know, sort of two years apart, taking on quite senior, sort of more managerial roles in the biotech organisation I was in. And that was very hard. You know, you come back from a maternity break after, it was only a few months, but the science has moved on, the organisation has moved on. And I think for anyone who's prone to imposter syndrome anyway, having that sort of environment, you know, having to re-establish your own confidence and your own credibility with what potentially is quite a difficult family situation, even if, I mean, I have a very supportive partner, but you know, I think, I suspect that that's quite common. And as I've sort of grown into more leadership positions, I do actually really take care of people, male or female, who are coming back from any kind of break, whether it's an illness or having to care for somebody. Or I think that's a sort of a time when, if you're already predisposed to imposter syndrome, it can really hit you hard at a time when you really, you absolutely need to be confident because you've got so much going on. So. And just a sort of reflection on the, you know, success, or, you know, how is that defined in science? You know, again, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's very important when you're undertaking scientific research that you actually take some risks, because if you don't, you're just going to do what everybody else does. So, you know, you end up running numbers of projects that, I mean, I cited the great success we had early on. I say we're lucky. I was going to use the word we're lucky. We built good collaborations, and we did some good science, and we did, you know, we did have, you know, an element of serendipity around how some of those connections were made. But there are many programs I've been involved in that have failed. But again, it's very important to celebrate the failures, to make sure that people understand the quality of the work was there. The question was, you know, answered in a way, well, this is not going to be a drug because the biology isn't there. So, and I think one thing that you can proactively do to help support people not go down into that sort of spiral of lack of confidence is properly celebrate good work that gives a decision that's a negative decision. Now, I think that's a very important learning that I've had through my career. So.
Jane, can I just add to that? Because something you said just triggered an idea from me, is that you said that the drug being a failure because it didn't work because the biology wasn't there. But you'll forgive me because I'm an arts-based person. But from what I've read is that some of the drugs that have been found to be a failure for a certain type of illness or condition have been found to suddenly translate to something else and found to be far more effective because they've understood more about the science. So it's not actually a failure. It's not actually a failure because, yes, it doesn't work in that situation, but could we translate it into something else?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I hate the word failure actually in science.
Yeah.
There is no, all there is data and decisions about data, you know, and a failure is a proactive, good decision based on data not to take something forward, you know, and I think that's a really very positive way of thinking about the scientific environment, which I think could really help people's confidence.
Yeah, and failures ultimately are learning points, and without failures,
Yes, absolutely.
you learn better
Yeah.
from that. So we should celebrate the failures sometimes as well. Although that's much harder to do, but we should certainly try. So the poll results, we had about 20% at early stage, close to 50% mid stage, and let's say 35% at mature stage. That gives you an idea of the people we have on the audience tonight. So one of the big questions coming into this obviously was, if you have imposter syndrome, what techniques are there that you can use to help yourself either overcome it, deal with it, cope with it, keep it at bay, or acknowledge it? So can we start with Wendy? Do you have some techniques you help people?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. And it's funny, I'm not sure I've ever used them on myself as you say that. I don't know. It's easier to coach other people than coach yourself, isn't it? The first one is, you know, as we've all, I think is as evident here, is to recognize you're not alone, right? Everybody has it at some point or another. But what I really do encourage people to do is kind of, imposter syndrome is that voice in your head, right? So get the voice out of your head and onto paper. What is that voice actually saying? What are the different things it's saying? And write them down and look at them. So you pull them out of yourself and you can look at them a little bit more objectively. As you look at them, try to figure out, who are you? What is it that you're contributing? What do you bring? And it's not just sort of skills and strengths, but, you know, we're talking about failure. What is it that you managed to go through? What did you take away from it? And how is that something that you're bringing into your next experience for somebody? That knowledge you gained about that failure or that innovation or assumption that didn't work. What is it that you're bringing? And then, you know, Giorgio, you talked about risks. So we've all talked about risks. So what are the risks of whatever it is you're thinking about doing that's making you feel like an imposter? And can you actually quantify those risks? You know, what's the risk of that happening? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? You know, is it 75%? And most often, I think people discover the risk is a lot lower when they quantify it than it's feeling like it is. And then what are the odds of it actually happening? So now you've got a 10% risk I'm sorry. So what are the odds of it happening? But then if it does happen, how bad is that? Is that terrible? Or is that, it's actually a risk I can tolerate? So I try to actually get people to do something very analytic with that emotional sense that they're feeling. And I think it helps people, both who are analytic, analyze, and then it helps people who are not so analytic create a structure to deal with the emotions that they're going through. And then I would add to that what I said before, which is adding that sort of other step of, who are you measuring yourself against as you're feeling this sense of being an imposter? Is it the successful CEO? Is it the movie star? Is it the celebrity? Is it the Nobel Prize winner? And is that really who you should be measuring yourself against? You know, if you're an Olympic rower, yes. If you are like most of the rest of us, probably not the right, you know, measure. But really, in that instance, who should you be measuring yourself against? And I'll tell you this, that you know, I didn't talk at all about any of my sense of being imposter syndrome, but we started a fund to invest in women entrepreneurs in the late 90s. And when we were doing it, there were next to no funds that existed investing just in women entrepreneurs. And so, of course, all the men running funds would say, well, we don't see the women entrepreneurs. And, you know, we know what we're doing. So we all know about the sort of egos in venture capital in Silicon Valley, and even on the East Coast of the US, the egos are not so different. So we were investing in the tech boom, and we lived through the tech bust and 9/11. and the market crash of 2008, with a portfolio that was created in 98 and 99 and 2000, when valuations were skyrocketing. So for those of you who don't remember that time and sort of those implications, it meant that your portfolio values were kind of in the tank. And so we're feeling like complete failures, complete imposters. We have no idea what we're doing. Why do we ever think we should be investing in startup women? Well, it really took looking at, again, who are we comparing ourselves to? If we look at the Silicon Valley funds from 1999, they didn't do very well if you looked at them in 2005 and 2009.
Yeah.
And it really took kind of understanding that everybody was experiencing very similar results to realize we were not imposters. So who are you comparing yourself to? And make sure it's the right reference set when you're assessing your own competence.
That's great. I particularly like the risk related view that you take. I think that's quite important. That someone with a finance background, it makes a lot of sense. And I must admit, it's something I've used myself to make decisions on, you know, what's the risk if it does go wrong, what's the likelihood of it going wrong in the first
What's the likelihood of it being something catastrophic? And it generally it's
acceptable. Absolutely. Jane, I think you've mentioned strategies before when we've spoken in the past about people you've worked with, helping them.
Yeah.
Essentially something you've used yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of elements to that. So I think firstly, you know, Rosemary mentioned turning this sort of into becoming an expert and how you sort of manage that. I think, you know, in the early days of my suffering from imposter syndrome, I did a lot of preparation to mitigate the risk, and I found that comforting but not sustainable, because as your role expands, you end up spending all your time over preparing. So sort of trying to understand you know, where I did feel that I wasn't as necessarily as well equipped as I could be for a certain meeting, making sure that I knew who else in the meeting was and turning the tables and getting help from them, and being prepared to sort of admit and ask for advice. So I think sort of getting that right level of preparation. And then the other thing that I found quite useful was sort of almost testing myself to take small steps outside of my comfort zone, and saying, oh, well, that was okay. I can do the next thing. I can do the next thing. I think sort of quite a nice progression in my career with my relationship with the UK Trade Association for the biotech industry, the BIA, which has been around, you know, throughout my career. And I started engaging in that just by going to events and talking to people that I didn't know, which was quite a big deal for me, because I still am an introvert, but I've trained myself not to be. So started out by going to events, talking to people. I then presented at an event, and that was sort of okay. And then somebody said, why don't you stand for the board? And I managed to get elected to the board, really prepared for my first board meetings. And then that became a bit more natural. And then I ended up being chair of the board. And, you know, the first time I did that was very daunting. I mean, there were people, you know, some very influential people on this board that I had to control, but I managed to do it. And the first time you do it, you do feel like a bit of a fraud and you're not going to get through it. But once you've done it once, then, you know, you use that experience. And I ended up having to give speeches to halls of 700 people as the first female chair of the Bioindustry Association, actually. So, and that took about 10 years to go through that process. But yeah, I tell that story to some of my colleagues at work of, you know, you just do take things incrementally, and it becomes more natural, and it just takes you out of your comfort zone in an easier way. So I'd say take incremental steps out of your comfort zone. And then the other thing that I think is really important is be prepared to accept praise. I used to be very, oh God, no, don't, you know, stop it, you know, that wasn't that good. And for God's sake, just accept it and say, thank you, yes. and give praise. That's the other thing I really try and do. And I say, well done, that was great, you know, and just those little things can make a big difference to people. And when you are given praise, say thank you, you know, and just don't get embarrassed about the praise, you know. And so I think that's another sort of hint for, you know, I think there's ways that you can cope personally around imposter syndrome. So I'd say, you know, the right level of preparation, incrementally out of your comfort zone, and be prepared to use people in the room. But then I think what we need to do certainly from sort of the perspective of bringing in the next generation and helping them, is let's make the environments as friendly as possible for people who might be suffering from doubt. So let's thank people, acknowledge people's contributions, ask people to contribute in meetings who are maybe a little bit more reflective or introverted, and praise people, and just role model how you would like to have been treated, you know, when you were in those situations yourself, really.
Thank you. That's very useful. Very useful. Thank you. And just nudge the audience. We're going to start taking questions. We've got a couple so far.
Can I
just, Rosemary?
Sorry, can I just add something on what Jane?
No, I was coming over to you anyway.
Looking at scientists, and I listen to scientists, and they all talk about logic and they all talk about theory, and it's lovely, it's great, it's a skill I really admire. And they said, I can't do this. And I suddenly thought, every time something happens to you, an emotion and a fact, it just triggers an emotion inside your head. And if you can identify those triggers, because the self-doubt, I'm doubting myself because I don't know this. Okay, I don't know about that. Is it something that I need in my toolbox? And when you start actually deciding which is the emotion, which is the logic, and you realize that, as Jane said, walking into a certain situation, it made her really, I can't do that. And you're going, I'm walking in, I'm going to talk to people like me, and you're walking around the opposite side of the table, right? And looking at the world from their perspective, you separate out the logic from the emotion from the logic, and it calms the emotion down so that you can actually let your brain think again. And we all have some wonderful brains inside our head. I mean, I sit around the table thinking, I couldn't do that. I've got, looking at all the PhDs that must be in the chat box, people in the chat box, they must have PhDs coming out of their ears. And I'm going, I can't do that. What am I talking? What am I on this panel for? And I went, stop. I'm not stupid. I've got 4 degrees in 4 different subjects, but it's using my skill to translate into something else, and something from somebody on the other side of the table going, wow. And it's separating out that emotion from the logic and going, I'm triggered because that situation in a previous time made me feel like that. This is different. I'm talking to that. I'm just going to talk to this person because they want to know about a certain subject. They've got something else to say too. And Jane, as you said, giving praise and acknowledging the praise and the information that you've been given before the input is given to you, it becomes a change of information. You get rid of this emotional thing.
Thank you. Great advice. Were you about to say something, Wendy?
Well, so many things keep coming up that I want to reiterate. The one about praise, for one thing. I had one coaching client, and really the homework every time was, you're going to track when someone praised you, and all you're going to say is thank you, and you're going to write it down.
Yep.
And at the end of every day, you're going to just look at that rather than tell this person, why, no, you really didn't deserve the praise. And that really was homework, and it had an effect. I mean, she started recognizing what she was doing. I also want to say, there was something Jane just said that I was going to key off of, and now she was talking about emotion. I can't quite remember, but I also wanted to make one more point, which is another thing that we do is we are always looking at outcomes, and we are measuring ourselves against outcomes instead of inputs. And so it can be really helpful to just, this goes back to sort of how to define success. Stop always looking at outcomes. This is how the world measures things. But if we can look at ourselves and assess what we put into the situation and not look for outcomes all the time, we can accept that we are competent. And the other thing I was going to say was, it really is, we're all on it. And there was this comment earlier in the chat, we're all on a growth program. Well, at least we hope we're all on it. If we're not on it, we're probably not in this conversation today. And so a piece, I think, of batting away the imposter monster is saying, oh, I'm actually on a journey. So where am I on this journey? I'm not at the end of it. And by the way, I hope I'm never at the end of it, but I'm on it somewhere. So let's recognize where I am. Maybe I'm a novice. Maybe I'm an advanced beginner. Maybe I'm intermediate. It's okay to be that. And it's okay not to have all the answers. I think this was the other point I was going to make, which was we assume we're supposed to have the answers. And I would say to a group of scientists, probably the first part is how to frame the question. Are we in the right question? Right. So let's focus more when we don't have answers, instead of beating ourselves up for what we don't know. What's much more relevant to me as somebody who looks at entrepreneurs all the time is, can you ask the right questions? Are your questions insightful, intelligent questions? Don't pretend to have the answers, because I know you don't have them, right? You can't have all the answers. I'm much more interested in what it is that you're trying to understand than pretending that you've got every answer.
I think that's a really good point, Wendy. And I think that being able to articulate what the problems are, and then how you build a sort of process and a discussion to get at that, I think is really important. I actually really like for that. I'm sure you guys know the De Bono's 6 hats of, if you feel like you're in a situation where you're not quite sure how to start framing, answering questions and getting information, this sort of 6 hats of what data do you want to collect? The sort of different coloured hats that you sort of put on to make sure you're covering all the options. So I think, I can't remember what colour matches what now, but what data do you need? What information would you like? What's the upside of doing this? What's the downside? How are people going to feel about this? And sometimes when you're sort of in a situation where you have a problem and you're sort of expected to come up with a way of solving, that's actually just quite a useful framework just to go back to and sort of take a breath and say, okay, let's get contributions from everybody in the room around these different aspects, and that can help frame questions as well. So
on questions, we actually have had a question from the audience. We've got regular